distinguished guests, brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen.
Okay, how's that family? My name is Brother Wright. We'd like to welcome everyone to the B.K. Mackey's History Club. We meet here every other Wednesday in honor of Amos Wilson, William Mackey Jr., Louis Ray Rivera, Brother Hassan, Alton Maddox, El-Haj Malik Al-Shabazz, Minister Khalid, Professor George Simmons, Miss Leona Maddox, who drove an old car from and came down from Patterson to support the UAM so she could bring people together. We never want to forget the work Miss Leona and Alton did with the UAM because she believed in bringing people together. So we want to thank her, Runoko Rashidi, and all the historians who gave her fame and fortune. So for the Zoom audience, we want to thank you for coming out in this extreme heat that we're having in New York City. They still came out and they did not leave. We want to thank the Zoom and the live audience. They did not leave. Our speaker was running a little late. Came from far away and she just got off on Fulton, so she's coming down. But we want to honor these folks, so we're going to bring the camera over to the Amos collection. And we're going to zoom in for Amos. Blueprint for Black Power. The psychology of self-hatred and self-defeat toward a reclamation of the African mind. Black on black violence. The awakening the natural genius of black children. Issues of manhood in black and white. Falsification of African consciousness. African-centered consciousness versus the New World Order. Louis Ray Rivera, Jazz in Jail. And S.K. Damian, and Destroy the Truth of Bastardization of African Cosmology. So those books is to help Sababu continue the work of Amos. And word out is that he's coming up with another book that he's redoing for Amos, and it's going to be like this, self-hatred. So Sababu was working real hard. But in honor of Louis Ray Rivera, when Maggie left us, Louis Ray would come down, and I never want to forget Louis. He used to come down and speak, and we'd walk him home, and he only lived 3 blocks away, and he'd speak for another hour and a half. So we never want to forget Louis Ray. Okay, so somebody has the mic on. We got to mute you. I got it. Okay. So we never want to forget Louis Ray. So I'm going to mention a few books, not all the books that we had because of the time, but Capitalism on a Ventilator. It's funny, these young girls were sitting on my stoop and they were smoking weed, and I came out the house and I made them get off the stoop, and I'm saying that you shouldn't even be smoking this stuff anyway. And the young lady looked at me, beautiful young sisters. Weed is legal. So in this book, it talks about the legalization of medical marijuana. And it's a shame that our political parties allowed this nonsense to be legal. And the youngsters are smoking it, and the guy right down the street, you can't do nothing to him. He's standing right there selling it and ain't got a care in the world. So I want to thank the Democratic Party for allowing this. Without sanctuary, everybody's talking about reparations, and they do this and do that, and it seems like nobody wants to read the book. Nobody wants to look in to see the hangings, the ropes, the cutting off the hands, in Rhodesia by Cecil Rhodes, all the atrocities that happened on the cotton plantations, on the sugarcane plantations in Brazil. This reparations movement is global, in America and all over the world. So the pictures is here, the postcards. Every time you turn around, we got some fool talking about a study. African slavery in the Caribbean and Latin America. Another book. For the Africanist family, thanks to Brother Trust Graham. Queen Nzinga in Angola. This sister was a bad warrior. And if we start acting like her, you wouldn't be disrespected by the chumps out there, because she was on the money. And this is another book from the Africanist family, Africans or African Americans, Black Identity and Political Activism in 1784 to 1861. We were running the gauntlet, and we was struggling, and we still struggling. So a lot of folks ain't paid no dues. So this book, I want to thank the Africanist family for having that. The Destruction of Black Civilization by Chancellor Williams. Chancellor did an excellent job with this book, because not everything in the continent of Africa was all right during those dynastic periods. There was a lot of conflict. There was a lot of holding on to the empire. There was a lot of fighting. There was a lot of control. Not everybody was together the same way it is now. Chancellor Williams went beyond the call of duty, and they're actually still doing this study of this book on the Know Thyself study group out of Asbury Park with Brother True and Trust in them. So this book is unbelievable on how Chancellor Williams talks about what went on in the land of the black, and how the Arab slave trade, and how the Arabs came in and enslaved the African before the European. But nobody never wants to talk about that, but Chancellor Williams did. Thank you, Chancellor. I never want to forget our sister, who, in my opinion, the only one that cared about the people of Georgia. And when Donald Trump said how a place is an S-hole country, well, she wrote a book on say how the U.S. created these S-hole countries. In her other blockbuster, When China Sneezes, from coronavirus lockdown to global political economic crisis. She doesn't even have a job in America. So Cynthia McKinney went beyond the call of duty with this book. My good friend, Ayo Kamati. Jews are the problem one, and Jews are the problem in psychology. Ayo Kamati, War on the Horizon, wrote these two books. They're small reads, but they tell you the history of these folks. And we want to thank him, so support him and purchase his book, read the books, and do the research. We want to thank Ayo. The Causes of Sudden Death Syndrome, 2021, 22, 23, 24, 25, and 26 is going to happen. The deaths of young football players, young athletes that's catching heart attacks. Edward Dow did an excellent report on this. So this book is unbelievable, and it's called Causes Unknown. The other book I'm talking about, I want to thank Kennedy in Children's Health Defense. It's a historical timeline, a fact-packed history of vaccines and their makers. And this book goes into vaccines, every kind of vaccine that we have taken. And it goes into the timeline. 1911, it goes all the way down to the 14s. 1507, 1555, the chronology, how it all started. And the book actually brings you up until 2023, 2024. It's the historical context of vaccines. So we want to thank the Kennedy organization. And I don't want to forget my good friend, Dr. Scott Whitaker. Dr. Scott Whitaker in his book, Medicine, and that's our speaker, the Causes and Solutions. Get this book. We have it here for our people, but you could also get it on Amazon, on different places. It is unbelievable. So, I'm going to name a few community events that the public can go on to get more information. So we have Power Pack information. First of all, tomorrow, Thursday, one of the hottest shows on the East Coast. Thorough Black Talk with Tad, Keisha, Ashe, Brother Black. Well, Ashe is not there. Brother Black and his sister Brooke is there. They have a new person involved with that. So that's one of the hottest shows on the East Coast, and it comes on Thorough Black Talk on YouTube every Thursday. Once you get in touch, Keisha will send you the information, and Tad and all of them, they be throwing down. Sister Mama, so we want to thank them for their program. It's hot. Also, Sister Empress Chief, Brother Lumumba, El Pollinator, and the Gladiators out of Philadelphia. They got Blog Talk Radio, Million Women's March. So that's Sister Empress, Brother Lumumba, and that program comes on Saturday at 10 o'clock. Saturday at 10 o'clock, Blog Talk Radio, and it's also a Zoom presentation where you can get in, and the number is 1-319-527-6189. 10 o'clock. That's an excellent program, and sometimes we still be talking, and it be like 1:30, 2 o'clock in the morning. Excellent program. We want to thank our Philadelphia connection. Also, Io Kamati, War on the Horizon. Io Kamati Live. Our brothers Anthony Mohammed out of Birmingham, Alabama, Sankofa Revolutionary Radio. WSYP 95.1 out of Birmingham. The 10 o'clock program is Dr. Haru with his excellent medical advice, and not only it comes on every Monday at 10 o'clock, Sankofa Revolutionary Radio. And Dr. Haru tells you about medical advice and the products that he has, but the thing about the program is that he wants you to read the information that he portrays before you purchase anything from him. He has the evidence and the studies to support it. And then, after, you have Io Kamati, comes on at 10 to 11. So you got, what's wrong?
On Monday, it's 9 o'clock.
Monday, yeah, 9 o'clock. But Io comes on from 10 o'clock to 11. So it's two programs. You got Dr. Haru comes on from 9 to 10, and then Anthony gives you another one, Io Kamati, in his blockbuster book, War on the Horizon, Psychology of the Jew and the Jews or the Problem. That comes on from 10 to 11. It's the hottest program, and you can actually call in. So we want to thank Anthony Mohammed and Sankofa Revolutionary Radio. Our Baltimore connections, Brother Darren Muhammad, State of the City. That Saturday blockbuster program is excellent. It comes on Instagram under State of the City, Baltimore, and it also comes on YouTube. Brother Darren Muhammad, that's Saturdays at 12 o'clock to 2 o'clock. And then he might come on Wednesday or Thursday. He comes on sometime Wednesday, sometime Thursday. It's a toss-up. But we want to thank Brother Darren and our Baltimore connection. Hottest program. We want to thank him. Now also, Dr. Aline, Your Immunity Project. That Zoom program comes on every Tuesday at 3 o'clock. Your Immunity Project with Dr. Aline. and then they give it a rebroadcast. Comes on again at 7 o'clock. So if you missed the 3 o'clock, you can log on and get to 7 o'clock, and then they come on Califani Radio on Thursday. So Dr. Aleem is coming out with some excellent information. Now, this Blockbuster Study Group program, this is the African Echo Study Group out of Newark. They give you a Friday African Echoes. It's live Zoom, and you can go out to Newark and sit in with Brother Trust, Brother True, and all the individuals out of that Friday group. They're doing the psychology of self-hatred. They also doing great black women in history, where they read a chapter of these dynamite black women and what they did, and people don't even know. So they have good conversation, and it's an excellent study group on Friday. That's African Echoes. Then they give you a Blockbuster #2, the Know Thyself Study Group out of Asbury Park. Also, Trust is the mediator, True, and everybody from Asbury Park, and they're doing the destruction of black civilization and actually letting you know the mistakes that were made in that continent. And it's an in-depth study group, where if you think you know something and you find out and you go deep, and you find out it's a whole different thing. So we want to thank those individuals. The Semotap organization with Dr. James McIntosh, Betty Dobson, Richard Dean Theodore, that comes on Tuesday at 10 o'clock. The Minefield program comes on Tuesday at 10 o'clock. And they're getting into Netflix. And see, Netflix, they're telling you about that disgusting reincarnation of the cartoon that they did with the Good Time series, and how they got the little kids doing all kinds of selling drugs, doing all kind of deviant sexual stuff on this cartoon, and it basically destroyed the image of the Good Time series. But what Netflix is so slick about, they have derogatory programs like this, and then they would have the Barry White concert. They would have another program with another black artist produced by Netflix. And Steph Curry, the basketball player, is involved with this Good Time. So all you gotta do is go on Netflix and look at it. And ask yourself, is this the way that black folks is supposed to be portrayed? And then you got the nerve to think that somebody's gonna give you some kind of reparations? That they're gonna say, it doesn't happen. They don't give people anything that they don't respect. If they don't respect you, they ain't giving you nothing. I don't care how many studies you have. It's not gonna happen. So, Semotap and Dr. Mack is doing an excellent job on the protests and trying to get them to get this nonsense off of the TV. It's a disgraceful, disgusting cartoon, and all the characters have been disrespected. From Thelma to all of them, to JJ, it's just disgusting. So you can't have this. And then they turn around and give you something good, a concert or some other drama on Netflix that you don't even look at the cartoon what's happening. So the protest is going on and we're still fighting. So we want to thank that. So those are just, you can view all the lectures on BK Mackey's History Club on YouTube. All our lectures from the great Dr. Lewis 11-part series or Burkina Faso in the Sahel region. He's going to come back for part 13. And he's going to put some extra information on what's happening down there. They're trying to get investment directly through the Bank of Burkina Faso. So it's good that you want to stick your chest out and say what Chirari is doing in the Sahel region, but it's a whole lot of other folks that's getting excellent dividends and is going to be reaping the rewards of natural resources for a long time. While black folks in America, the only thing they're doing is sticking their chests out and saying they agree and they're happy what's happening, but they are fighting tooth and nail over there to continue that, because the Barracudas ain't just gonna leave. You just don't leave after having control of something for all these years and selling it and robbing it. So also the UNIA, and Dr. Haroon was out at the UNIA has a store. It's a baby Jetros. It's basically a wholesale Jetros where they sell bulk items, all black. So what Raymond Dugal and Michael Duncan and the UNIA is doing is they're trying to get us and reprogram us to at least go to the Rock. The Rock is on 13205 Merritt Boulevard. Big place, directly next to the Home Depot. And they have parking, and when you go in there, everybody in there is black. They got their own bakery where the bread come out the oven scalding hot. They got their own studio, their freezer, and everybody in there is working hard. And so what the UNIA is doing under the Great Garvey movement is trying to reprogram us, myself included, where I have to say, instead of going to these big box stores, these Costco's, these Targets, these BJ's, that at least once a month, or when you can get out there and say, listen, let me go to a place and spend my money. And they have the shrimp, it's the same thing, the big bulk. So under the UNIA, and to continue the great work of Garvey, they're doing an excellent job, because we have to be reprogrammed to at least try to spend our money with somebody else where you don't have to worry about what people are saying and, oh, you disrespected me in the store, They're not doing that there. Everybody is respectful. They're working hard. The prices is reasonable. You buy in bulk. They have restaurants going there. It's just like Jetros. It's just like the discount houses. So the UNIA, and once you go in, you can find out when they have their monthly meetings. They got a Brooklyn chapter. So they're doing a whole lot of stuff to reprogram black folks, where we don't have to worry about what other races is doing, because they basically say race first. Now, you could, whatever you do, you could put second, but race first. So we want to thank the UNIA, and they're having the parade is coming up. The African Art Festival is coming up July 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th at Commodore Park. We need everybody comes out there anyway. And even though it be hot, the food is good, so you come out there and you have fun, you bring the kids, let them play in the park, they got the pool there, and you try to, just everybody goes out to the African Art Festivals. So we want to thank UNIA and for doing that. So we got couple of minutes and she's going to come out. Also, we have her book, Booker T. Washington and Africa, the Making of a PanAfricanist. And I didn't know, I was always under the impression that old Booker T was this, that, and the other. But come to find out, old Booker T was a bad dude. And I remember reading this book. He taught black people how to make bricks. He taught black people how to make bricks. And we don't own a brick making company nowhere. You know. So, and I remember Dr. Clark used to say, you can say what you want to say about him, but they said every time he opened up his mouth, they gave him a shopping bag full of money for Tuskegee. And he got the education going. So, I don't know, but Sister Tyrene lays it down on the good stuff that old Booker T was doing, you know. So we want to give her thanks. So it's a lot of stuff going on. Try to drink a lot of water, get your water from fruit, get your water from beverages, and stay hydrated in this extreme heat. And it ain't nothing we can't handle. You know, I can recall the time when you were on the cotton plantation in Mississippi or Brazil and you're talking about it's hot. And the old master would say, I'm going to show you what hot is. And you pull that whip out and did something to you, boy, you ain't cry about hot no more. So it ain't nothing that we can't handle in basically June, July, August. The weather is always scalding hot. But the melanin takes care of that. The melanin absorbs it. You get the vitamin D, as Dr. Aru talks about. You know, so all the lectures is on that under the BK Mackey History Club. And Dr. Lewis will be coming back, you know. So, I'm going to give it a couple of more minutes. Dr. Ben, Black Man of the Nile. And Dr. Ben, you never want to forget him with his book, and he tells you everything that they did. Another excellent book that we have out here is The Manufacturing of a President, the CIA insertion of Barack Hussein Obama Jr. into the White House. And Wayne Mansfield did an excellent job on exposing this guy. Excellent publication. And here's another blockbuster book we want to thank Dr. Lewis. The Unspoken Alliance, Israel's secret relationship with apartheid South Africa. So if you really think that other people is running South Africa, you better think again. Israel's secret relationship with apartheid South Africa.
I thought everyone was.
This book is excellent. So when they have, when you think somebody's kicking farmers off of land, somebody's always behind the curtain. And another 3 books, and you got one, George Soros, The Life and Time and Trading Secrets of George Soros. how George Soros and Hillary Clinton took control of the Democratic Party, and this blockbuster, the man behind the curtain, George Soros. So in our last election, black folks always lose. Soros and Bloomberg-backed candidates win while they use our votes. So ladies and gentlemen, coming back with part 2 on the making of a Pan-Africanist, part 2. Tyreen Wright is going to come. She ran a little late due to the heat problems, but she came all the way, and we want to give her a great big hand and let her do her thing. And we all say thank you very much.
Hello. Thank you. Yes, today was rough because of the weather. It was.
It hurts to help us reach out to others. The hurt is roughly they aren't.
Now, I actually do have imagery that I wanted to. I do have slides. Should I send it to you? Put it on there?
That's why I thought that you would get it.
I have a computer or however we could do it or not.
I have to project it, but I'm not sure.
You're not sure? I have my computer, so is that, or do you wanna?
No, it's late.
Okay, so we'll go right to it.
Next
Yeah.
time when you come early, we can hook up the projector.
Yeah. No problem. Hello, everyone. Thank you for your patience. It was rough today. Everything was, not running or running slow due to the weather. So, welcome. A month ago, was it about a month ago? It was about a month ago that I was here, and I talked about, obviously, Booker T. Washington in Africa. Gotta get my glasses. The Making of a Pan-Africanist is the title. Booker T. Washington in Africa, right? So sometimes people forget that it is about Washington's role in Africa and his clandestine life. I actually, before coming, since it took me so long, I actually got a chance to listen to my last lecture here, and I wanted to make sure that I covered everything that I didn't cover last time. And it occurred to me that when I was here a month ago, we talked about the African exclusion measure, but it's even more relevant now because of all of the immigration stuff going on. And the fact that there are various groups who feel like Booker T, that black people, African people in America, should be protesting and be involved with ICE and essentially protest, challenge ICE, show a presence. So with that in mind, I want to just highlight for you some of the contributions. I'm going to start out highlighting for you some of the contributions that us as African people have made to support African immigrant populations, AKA in the context of the African exclusion measure, right? But even more than that, just to highlight as well the idea of the art of protest, which comes out of the Black freedom struggle, right? So if anybody wants to know what black people have done for African immigrants, African immigration, African people immigrating from the Caribbean, Central, and South America in particular, it is the African exclusion measure. because the case I discussed when I was here last time about the 1915 larger immigration bill that was coming before Congress and had already passed in the Senate in December 31st, 1914, would and intended to lock out anyone of the Black or African race, but had already passed in the Senate, okay? And was on its way to the House to pass and become part of the larger immigration bill. And it would have changed the demographic in Black communities in the United States from that point on out. Few people, except for those of us who are researchers and are in researching these kind of things and producing scholarship, few people know about the African exclusion movement. Hopefully many people know now, because this book is actually 10 years old and it's all over the world, from Zimbabwe to here and into Central and South America. However, the point is that that was our major contribution to African immigration. Booker T. Washington stopped the government, particularly senators, from closing the doors indefinitely or infinitely. And that was the desire that they had in introducing the African exclusion measure, which I discussed last time. And I'll go back to it just a little bit. The other thing is I'm going to go not into the African exclusion measure as much this time because I covered it last time, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Liberian crisis, which is the other case in the book, and why. I think it's important for us to recognize something, which is that, and I sort of hit on it at the end, but it's important for us to understand that our situation in Liberia is very similar to other settler groups, unfortunately. The significant difference with us in the context of Liberia, African people in the context of Liberia, and other groups in the world, and you should certainly know what I'm talking about. There are other groups in the world that have been settled in places, and they have not settled in peace. And so it is chaos. But the point of addressing the Liberian crisis is, one, to engage in what I consider a level of self-criticism, right? From coming from within the group. I'm not Americo-Liberian, thank you. I'm not Americo-Liberian, however, I am the ethnic group that ends up in Liberia, right? What many of us are. But there are rules of engagement that I think that we were not aware of and were not in the practice of addressing, meaning that the posture in which the so-called Americo-Liberian population settles in Liberia is not correct, right? What do I mean? I mean that this settler group of people would go settled by the POOL, the American Colonization Society, and begin to engage in creating systems, right, and structures that include themselves but exclude the indigenous Liberian population. It caused many clashes, and it's important to understand that the United States in particular never made at that time, never made any real commitment to Liberia. Because to make a commitment to Liberia would mean that it would have to be followed with some sort of economic backing, right? So if we are in a relationship to you, then we also have to talk about the economics of that relationship. And the United States was not interested in that. They called themselves saying, Africa, we're going to leave that up to the French or the British, as I shared last time, and the Portuguese, and the Germans, but the Germans got very little, Namibia, and made a mess of it, of course. engaged in biological warfare of the Herero, Nama, and Obongo peoples of Namibia. But as far as the United States was concerned, their exploits were in South America, and they were leaving Africa alone to the European powers. And so what the United States does do is sit off the coast of Liberia and comes inland, off the coast, meaning via the Navy, and comes inland periodically to put down clashes between the indigenous Liberian population and the African population from America, who is being called the Americo-Liberian population that is settled. There are numerous clashes of these sorts that go on, but the United States is sitting off coast, only coming inland to play sort of referee and break up these clashes at that time, and then recede, you know, without commitment once again. And so the French and the British are, you know, sort of lobbying the United States to say, do you want Liberia? Do you want this piece of land? Because if you don't want it, we sure will take it, okay? And the United and are threatening to imitate each other on opposing borders to annex pieces of the territory that is known as present-day Liberia. So what Booker T. Washington is involved in is interrupting that at the behest of the Liberian population, right? And the Americo-Liberian population, and I'll get into the particulars of that because there is a delegation that comes here. Those of you who have the book already, you see the picture that actually is in shadows on the cover of the book, all these men here. The real image is actually inside the book and in the last chapter on the Liberian crisis. But those men are, I think I read them off, various former president, former vice president, and other officers from Liberia, and then, of course, some of Booker T. Washington's people. But they are in the garden at Tuskegee with the point of visiting and Washington prepping them for what would eventually be a meeting in Washington, D.C. with President Roosevelt, incumbent President Roosevelt, President-elect Taft, the Secretary of State at that time, Elihu Root, and the Liberian delegation that you see in that image, along with Booker T. Washington in the White House, okay? And he facilitates that meeting for the purpose of negotiations to protect the survival of Liberia. So I'm going to start with something I think you all can appreciate. And that is, where did Booker T. Washington even get this idea to be concerned about Africa and the outcomes of African people? And it comes from a very, I guess you could say, likely place. Washington would write about his desire to know Africa as a result of knowing his own who? Mother. Right? So the seed of Pan-Africanism is planted in that way. What he is about to talk about, and this actually comes to in my book, but it comes from the source of it, was his personal papers, and once again, the story of the Negro, the rise of the race of from slavery. And he talks about how he learns of Africa and his desire to know more about the people who had produced his mother. So I'm going to give you just a little bit of that. I'm not going to read too much, but I'll read just a little bit of that about Washington's early beginnings, how he becomes interested, and then I will go back to the Liberian crisis and his role in it. So the seed was planted because Booker T. Washington, some of you may have thought about this or questioned it. Du Bois talks about his genealogy at different points in his life. He writes an essay called On Race, where he gets deep into his genealogy, and he's talking about all of these French people and European ancestry. And you almost can't figure out who's an African and who is not in his telling of his genealogy and his story. But ultimately, don't get me wrong, ultimately at the end of that little essay, Du Bois declares himself a child of Africa. He talks about what is Africa to me, you know. Well, Booker T. Washington is similar, but his story is a little more interesting. Du Bois claimed his non-African ancestry. Booker T. Washington did not. And here's how we know. He talks about his mother, and his mother was a product of African people. And I'll give you the specific language. But then he also talks about who sired him, another term for father. Not father, but biologically fathered him. And he uses the term sire. That being said, he said it was an unknown, he knows his mother, but all he knew of his father was that he was some white male from a neighboring plantation. So yes, Booker T. Washington, by all accounts, was sired by some white male who was a worker at a neighboring plantation. We can assume that in the context of enslavement, that his mother very likely did not choose that relationship or choose to bear a child from that relationship. And why would I say that? Because she had a husband of her own. If you ever wondered where the name Washington came from, he borrowed that name from his mother's husband, who was not his father, when it was time to go to school. And out of necessity, he uses the name Washington from his mother's husband. So we know that Washington is not the name of his biological father. And by his account, his father was an unknown male from a neighboring plantation. He's far more interested in knowing his African origins than anything else. And he doesn't claim, aside from me telling you this, he makes no claim to connect with them. He does a tour in Europe at one point in time, but his then writer and researcher named Robert Parks, who accompanies him through this trip, on this trip through Europe, becomes angry with him when he realizes that Washington is not at all interested in the people or European culture. He is far more interested in gathering information to prove that the African person is not the man farthest down. And that was the title of the book that he would write and put this research during his tour of Europe in. Okay? The Man Farthest Down was a book written by Washington. Some people liken it to a conversation about the agrarian culture, agricultural life in Europe. But in actuality, Robert Parks writes about and sort of dispels this idea that he was researching agricultural life. And at that, he was gathering information to write this book to say that the man farthest down in the world is not the African person. Given the conditions, anybody could be, such conditions, anybody could be the man farthest down. And in fact, he is arguing the man farthest down is not the African, but in fact a European. And Europeans in their poverty in Europe. Okay? So Robert Parks discovers that Washington is not at all interested in connecting with the impoverished Europeans at that time, but in arguing and making his thesis about who African people are, right? So in other words, the myth of the lowly African, the uneducated African, the uncivilized African, he sought to disprove this with writing The Man Farthest Down. And Robert Parks, like I said, who was a white sociologist from the University of Chicago, would be his ghostwriter and accompany him in the time doing this research. So Washington's mother, who stays with him, I guess in spirit throughout all of this, is his constant motivation in terms of connecting with Africa, okay? So let me just read a little bit about this. Washington knew very little about his biological father, and he knew even less about how his parents encountered each other. Washington's mother was an enslaved African woman, and his biological father, by all accounts, was a white male inhabitant from a neighboring plantation. He described the nature of their relationship in his autobiography, deeming them both unfortunate victims of the institution of slavery. Consequently, there is no account of Washington exploring his Anglo-American or European roots or lineage, but it was to the contrary regarding his mother and her African ancestry. Washington's first inquiries about Africa were closely associated with his mother and his desire to know more about the people that produced her. Unfortunately, due to a general lack of knowledge about Africa amongst the formerly enslaved population, he was unable to learn anything significant about the continent during his childhood. However, some were able to offer an account of the Middle Passage. So he's saying that at that time, people were able to talk about the Middle Passage, people who had survived it, or people who were one generation removed from surviving it, right? However, some were able to offer an account of the Middle Passage that had been handed down. They told of the arduous 2 or 3 month journey at sea and all enslaved persons kidnapped and transported to the continent of Africa, transported from the continent of Africa to the Americas endured. So this is Washington directly. This is what he writes about this. I learned, however, that my mother's people had come from across the water, but from a more distant and more mysterious land where people lived a different life from ours, had different customs, and spoke a different language. From that I had learned to speak of the long and terrible journey by which my ancestors came from their native home in Africa. Important. So, one of the things that I do as a researcher, I'm looking at his rhetorical structure, right? His language, how he is talking about himself. He's not saying, you know, my mother came from those people, you know, who live like non-humans in Africa. He's saying specifically. I learned of the long and terrible journey of the long and terrible journey by which my ancestors came from their native home. So he's saying my ancestors came from their native home, where? In Africa. He's not confused, right? But not until I was a man did I meet anyone among my people who knew anything definite, either through personal knowledge or through tradition of the country or the people from whom my mother sprang. Formal education left Washington disappointed. He was unable to capture the African person's story from Africa to the Americas. Textbooks of his day were authored by white Americans and offered very little insight into the authentic history of Africa. And once the opportunity to learn presented itself, Washington had a realization. He says, "It seems to me now," this is quoting Washington, as I recall, my first definitive impression of my race in Africa, that the books I read when I was a boy always put the pictures of Africa and African life in an unnecessarily cruel contrast with the pictures of the civilized and highly cultured Europeans and America. He decided, Washington didn't decide, end quote, so that was Washington talking. He decided to educate himself as the text tended to reinforce distorted notions of African history, culture, and people. Washington's initial pursuit of Africa was rooted in one core belief that a race, and quote, open quote, a race that could produce a good and gentle and loving a woman as my mother must have some good in it that geographers had failed to discover, end quote. So in other words, what he's saying is that he did not believe anything he saw in print or was told in traditional education. He didn't believe it. He went on his own pursuit to know and understand the African continent and African people. Okay? And his inspiration for doing so was his mother. He's saying the people that could produce this woman must have some good in them that geographers had failed to discover. And so he begins to research and study about Africa. And that really is how he ends up involved in all of these things that are presented here. That is how he ends up being engaged in the African exclusion measure, how he ends up engaged in the Liberian crisis, how he ends up propagandizing against the atrocities in the Congo Free State. So on and on and on, right? So what I'm going to go to next, I wanted to establish that because I don't think that when I was here last time I got into that in particular. Another thing I wanted to touch on is Washington's role in the first Pan-African Conference of 1900. I touched on it a little bit. However, I want to give more context because there is a great portion of this. Okay. There's a great portion of this where I get into recreating the setting that existed in the world at the time that the first Pan-African Conference in 1900 would take place. So for those of you who read the book, you know there is a great chapter called Booker T. Washington, Pan-Africanism and Pan-Africanist, right? I'm going to read the opening, and I don't know if I did this last time, but I'm going to read the opening of this chapter just to sort of pull you into what he was feeling and what he was up to at this moment, 1900, the turn of the century. There is, however, a tie which few white men can understand, which binds the American Negro to the African Negro, which unites the black man of Brazil and the black man of Liberia, which is constantly drawing into closer relations all the scattered African people, whether they are in the old world or the new. I have rarely met in America anyone of my race who did not, in one way or another, show a deep interest in everything connected to with Africa. The millions of Negroes in America are almost as much interested, for example, in the future of Liberia and Abyssinia as they are in their own country. There is always a peculiar and scarcely definable bond that binds one black man to another black man, whether in Africa, Jamaica, Haiti, or the United States. And that's Booker T. Washington. Now, some people say, I think he was telling a fib by saying, you know, everyone here is interested, but you have to think about at his moment in time what the energy was. Now, I don't doubt there were some who weren't interested, but those he was coming in contact with, or at least what he wanted to promote, was that we are interested in the welfare and the future of Africa, right? So in the year of 1900, you all know already, probably too well, Henry Sylvester Williams, who would be the person from the African Association. I actually remember talking about this when I was here, who would initiate the first Pan-African Conference. Henry Sylvester Williams was from Trinidad, and he would be residing in London while they organized to put on this conference. The energy in the world at the time, the diaspora is the setting for the emergence of Pan-Africanism, right? We will have the highest expressions of Pan-Africanism on the continent with independence movements, with liberation movements, and the understanding led by the OAU and people like Nkrumah that it can't just be independence of singular African countries. We're looking for total liberation and independence of the African continent, right? But Pan-Africanism as a concept comes out of the African diaspora, out here in the Americas mainly. And there is a buzzing throughout the Western Hemisphere amongst African community and African people in terms of them understanding the necessity for us to organize, not just in our locales, but globally to address a common issue, right? So it's with this level of developing consciousness that Booker T. Washington engaged the world. Shortly before the turn of the 20th century, he was formally exposed to the philosophy of Pan-Africanism, much in the same way as the rest of the world. In other words, the world didn't know Pan-Africanism before 1900. The term had never been coined. The phrase would be coined by Henry Sylvester Williams. And so that is the birthday, you could say, or the birth of Pan-Africanism in terms of the term, right? At that time. Now, let me be clear. Pan-Africanism, you could say, has probably existed long before that. There are many, many, many accounts, and I will touch on some here. But in this moment in time, we come to know the term in the same way as Washington, through its introduction by Henry Sylvester Williams and the African Association. On behalf of the African Association, Williams wrote to Booker T. Washington for the first time in September of 1898, 2 years before the conference, to solicit his support in their efforts to organize for the benefit of African people. He extended membership to Washington while enlisting his assistance in promoting the organization in the U.S. He wrote, "I take you are alive to the necessity of a general union amongst the children and descendants of Ham." You guys know about the biblical Ham, you know. I won't get into it because I don't believe the curse of, I don't believe in that curse on the children of Ham, because the idea is that we are the children of Ham. And if you ever heard some of their, I don't have the whole quote down pat, but it's something to the effect that his children would be born ugly and black. They will be shamefully elongated, on and on and on and on, right? I reject that fundamentally, right? I think Washington did too, but nonetheless, very often throughout the African world, you'll hear people reference Ham, the children of Ham, which is a biblical reference. On behalf of the African Association, Williams wrote Booker T. Washington for the first time in September 1898 to solicit his support in their effort to organize for the benefit of African people. He extended membership to Washington while enlisting his assistance in promoting the organization in the U.S. He wrote, "I take it you are alive to the necessity of a general union amongst the children and descendants of Ham, as it would tend to create a respect for us, which he believed did not exist." Washington agreed and was eager to promote the organization. The objective of the African Association was, as described by Henry Sylvester Williams, was to respond to the need for unity amongst African people in order to garner respect in the world. The organization would make representations in cases of oppression affecting our people wherever found. During the latter part of 1898, the association began planning the first Pan-African Conference in order to advance their aims. In June of 1899, Williams wrote Booker T. Washington from London regarding the conference and enclosed a circular requesting that Washington, or a representative of his choice, present a paper on lynching. In the U.S., Washington accepted the invitation and promised to make it known as widely spread as possible. He not only promoted the conference through the black press, he outlined the agenda and deemed it a very important movement on the horizon. So in other words, Booker T. Washington is one of the first, and if you were to Google this, just in Google, Booker T. Washington and the first Pan-African Conference, you would see it pops up, even likely in Wikipedia, showing that Booker T. Washington was the first person to call Pan-Africanism a movement that was not simply a one-and-done type of thing in 1900, but was going to be a continuous movement throughout the world. And he was right. Washington's objective was to promote the first Pan-African Conference to the masses of African people in America. In his letter to the editor, he noted that the British government's plans to hold an international event where representatives from various countries would gather in London. He explained how the first Pan-African Conference could benefit from the assembling of African people already taking place in England. And so he gets all into that, but what were we all doing at that moment in time throughout the African world? Well, the African world was buzzing from the Caribbean through Central and South America, and Washington was aware of this. He would correspond with many of them. And so let me share with you all the people who were actually making contribution to the construction of this concept of Pan-Africanism as it was emerging. It was something like, cooking a dish. We were all making contributions to this dish that we knew was essential for our survival. And so the social climate and consciousness of the African diaspora in the Western Hemisphere and throughout the world produced two of the most prolific Pan-Africanists, W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey. Hold on, that is not exactly what okay. That's not exactly, that was in fact true, but that was not what I wanted to read. Prior to the first Pan-African Conference, 19th and early 20th century Pan-Africanism in the United States was espoused and practiced by individuals like Bishop Henry McNeill Turner, Martin Delaney, Edward Blyden, Henry Highland Garnett, and Alexander Crummell. Yes, this is essentially a roll call of all the Pan-Africanist or Pan-African sentiment that existed before that conference in 1900, right? And Washington had relationships with some of these people. I'll get into that. Bishop Henry McNeill Turner, who was a well-known Back to Africa proponent of the Back to Africa movement, and Washington had a relationship with them. But nonetheless, so he names, Bishop Henry McNeill Turner, Martin Delaney, Edward Blyden, Henry Highland Garnett, and Alexander Crummell. But as early as 1829, David Walker's appeal to the colored citizens of the world reflected on the history of African civilizations and made a connection between those in Africa and Africans scattered abroad. His appeal not only aimed to challenge the institution of slavery, but to educate the masses on African history and culture. Pan-Africanists among the African population in the Caribbean included the initiator of the first Pan-African Conference, Henry Sylvester Williams of Trinidad, Marcus Garvey's mentor, J. Robert Love, and Dr. J. Albert Thorne from Barbados. But decades prior to their emergence, the Haitian Revolution occurred and bolstered Pan-African consciousness in the diaspora as well. Haiti would produce Benito Sylvain and Antenor Furman, both of whom met Booker T. Washington in 1897 and attended the first Pan-African Conference in 1900. So in other words, you can imagine from all these locales in the Western Hemisphere, you have African people who understand the necessity of us to unify and create a circumstance where we address the exploitation and oppression that we were all experiencing globally, right? So when I talk about Pan-Africanism, people always are very quick to think about Du Bois, to think about Marcus Garvey even, but they don't think about these elders, these ancestors that actually came even before them. Henry McNeill Turner, right? Blyden, those coming from Barbados, those coming from Haiti, and of course the Haitian Revolution. All right. One of the things people don't get about the Haitian Revolution, because we know Haiti as a country now, but Haiti, and I had to say this to a close friend of mine. I was talking to her and I said, you know, she says to me, everybody is concerned about Africa. Nobody is concerned about Haiti. And I said, but aren't Haitian people African? So, meaning, and I said, so when people are concerned about African people, does that not include Haiti? And Haiti is the setting for the first independent, and I'm not going to say Black Republic, I'm going to say the first free and independent African nation in the Western Hemisphere, right? The people, and we have to say African if we're going to use, just sheer logic, because ethnically, they would have the ethnic diversity that is actually represented or existing on the continent, right? So we are a number of ethnic groups, all in one setting, just the same way we are here. But we consolidated, we coalesced, and sometimes we were forced to do that, right? And so we, out of many, that saying, now the European uses that phrase, right? Out of many comes one, but it's more true for us. Out of many comes one. We are unifying and emerging as one because we have a common condition of oppression and exploitation throughout the world. So really, Haiti becomes a microcosm of African independence. Can we fight it out enough and work it out enough to engage in a struggle together, collectively, that will lead to our absolute freedom and independence, right? We were aware, so in other words, we are aware, like we have been in the past, of our original ethnic identities. But we had to work that out, right? We had to work that out, and we do. Before the Haitian Revolution in 1739, there's a rebellion here called what? The Stono Rebellion. Some believe that this rebellion in particular inspired the Haitian Revolution. And what would happen? 1739, Stono Rebellion, in none other than what? South Carolina. Okay? And the people, what produced this? What happened? There were too many of us from the Angola region on plantations in South Carolina. Which means what? We understood who we were to each other ethnically. We were familiar with each other, and therefore even sometimes familiar linguistically. So the Stono Rebellion is about a march to Florida, to free African settlements in Florida. We are able to organize through language initially, but where the language fails because of our ethnic diversity, they adopted the drum. So if you went back and watched anything about the Stono Rebellion, you would know that the drumming called the other enslaved African persons in the area to the march to Florida. And in their path, they would leave carnage, right? Because this is what they were willing to do to gain their freedom, okay? But Europeans and the Anglo-American enslavers would learn that to put us on plantations in proximity to each other, people who were on the continent and familiar with each other ethnically would be a danger to them. That is what they learned from the Stonewall Rebellion. That to have us in proximity to each other and ethnically familiar with each other would allow us to organize, the opportunity to organize. And so I couldn't stress enough this overwhelming collective contribution to this concept of Pan-Africanism, not just being from the United States, the Blydens, the, Henry Highland Garnetts and all of that, but also many from the Caribbean, Central and South America, and ultimately, of course, from the continent of Africa. So, back to Haiti, just this little piece. Benito Sylvain and Antonio Furman, both who met Booker T. Washington in 1897 and attended the first Pan-African Conference in 1900. So two individuals, Sylvain and Furman, would make it to the conference in London in 1900 and would meet Booker T. Washington in 1898. Out of Haiti came a wing of Pan-Africanists who created literary discourse and diasporic philosophies on Africa. The African population in Haiti produced Jean Prince Mars and Louise Joseph, and who repeatedly explained that Haiti was the embodiment, let me say that again, Haiti was the embodiment of the irresistible force of a united Africa. Pan-Africanism had a dialectical characteristic to it, which allowed historic events like the Haitian Revolution to produce a response and rise in consciousness amongst African people internationally. Similarly, in 1896, the Ethiopian victory over Italian imperialist forces in the Battle of Ottawa also bolstered the connection between diasporic Africans and those on the continent. The social climate and consciousness of the African diaspora in the Western Hemisphere and throughout the world produced here in the United States two of the most prolific Pan-Africanists, W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey. Each of those men had important relationships and exchange with Booker T. Washington. Marcus Garvey's relationship with Washington would open up the door both literally and figuratively to the first mass organization of the African world, the Universal Negro Improvement Association. However, Washington's relationship with Du Bois would be inconsequential to the progress of Pan-Africanism. The relationship between Washington, the apparent accommodationist, and Du Bois, the Pan-Africanist scholar activist, has shaped African American social and political history in the United States for at least a century. So I'll leave it there, and that's my little sort of presentation, not a complete presentation, but presentation on the origin of Washington's Pan-Africanist sentiment. What is his connection with Africa? His mother. Where does Pan-Africanism emerge from? It comes from the diaspora, but it is a collective contribution. It is truly a communal production in the sense that we all made a contribution to it in terms of its formation, Pan-Africanism. And then, Washington's relationships with various Pan-Africanists have everything to do with this concept of unity for the purpose of eradicating oppression and exploitation, which would be the bare bones definition of Pan-Africanism coming out of the 1900 first Pan-African Conference. And later on, I talk about it in the book for those of you who have read it. Later on, we will get other definitions of Pan-Africanism, okay? We will get, Nkrumah's definition of Pan-Africanism, certainly much later, right? Unified Africa under scientific socialism. We would get, Du Bois' idea of Pan-Africanism. His idea speaks through the Pan-African Congresses, right? Where he, of course, we have to understand, Du Bois believes in this idea of the intelligentsia emerging and bringing and carrying or uplifting the rest of the race, okay? So it's not unlikely, and it wasn't a surprise, that Du Bois would be the sole survivor of the first Pan-African Conference, but would go on in 1919 and establish with others the Pan-African Congresses, right? The Pan-African Congresses. Many people, students of Pan-African history, have to know this. First Pan-African Conference in 1900, Pan-African Congresses in 1919, and Du Bois, sole survivor of the 1900 conference. All the members and parties involved in the first conference are deceased by 1919. So it's with that, understanding that Washington begins to put himself into African policy, African politics, African affairs on the continent, right? And the first would be in the context of the Congo. But before I get to the Congo, I want to touch on one little thing. What is he doing on the continent? What does he want to do? You know, like, what does Washington want to do on the continent? He is influenced by his mother. He's being pulled in by the African Association into Pan-African activity for the first time as it emerges. He has Henry McNeill Turner, who is a Back to Africa proponent, who he is friends with, and out of respect for him, Washington engages an understanding of what the Back to Africa movement, as per Henry McNeill Turner, is all about, right? And I think the last time I was here, I talked about how he looked at all the European presence on the continent and noticed that when they hadn't taken a territory, they would call the territory in their sphere of influence, okay? Which is the way to say, we haven't stated claims, but we want that piece, and we are, you know, guarding it, or we are coveting it, or we are, you know, on it, pretty much, okay? And so Washington thought with that there was no viable place for the African person in America to resettle in Africa, given that Europeans had overrun the place after the Conference of Berlin. And essentially he said that he was not willing to entertain living under another tyrannical colonial regime just to be in Africa. But once he figures out, and this is what it is, once he figures out what he wants to do for African people, he begins to actively engage in that. And what does he do? He perfects the Tuskegee model. And what do you do with anything that you love or anything that you perfect? You share it with the people that you love, that you care about, that you say you are doing this for. And so Booker T. Washington perfects the Tuskegee model with an understanding that he plans to export the model and its practices to the African continent, okay? Share this with the African continent, not impose this on the African continent. So chapter 3 of this book is dedicated to the Tuskegee model in Africa, which was the logical next step for Washington. He talks about it in the story of the Negro. He talks about the fact that he wanted to go to Africa, work in Africa, engage African people. But at a certain point, he realized that that is never going to happen. This is my opportunity to tell a really important story. I don't think I told it, about Tuskegee and its founding. Did I talk about, do you all remember that? Did I talk about Lewis Adams? No, okay, great. So I'm going to talk about the Tuskegee model in Africa. What is Tuskegee? What was Tuskegee? Tuskegee initially was nothing before it comes out of the people. There is a man named Lewis Adams who had survived slavery. He was a leader in the community. He had survived Reconstruction and the reversal of radical Reconstruction. And in or around 1881, Lewis Adams was approached by a man, a politician, Foster, who was a senator for the state of Alabama. And he would approach Lewis Adams, who was an elder by this time, and asked him to support him and organize the black vote in his favor. Lewis Adams agreed to do this, being a community leader. He organizes the black vote in the favor of Foster, who is a senator. Foster becomes reelected, and he comes back to Tuskegee and asks Lewis Adams, what does he want? And Lewis Adams, a man who had survived slavery, answered very simply. He said, I want a school for my people. Okay? He didn't say a team of oxen. He didn't say a plot of land. He didn't say, I want you to pull me into the political realm. You know, I'm mad about the end of Reconstruction. He didn't say any of those things. He didn't even say I, per se, except for saying, well, no, he doesn't say I. He says a school for my people, right? I think it's a wonderful story because most people, one, think Booker T. Washington is the conceptual father. Booker T. Washington was the first principal. He called himself the principal of Tuskegee. And he was, in many ways, the father of Tuskegee because he raised it. He raised it from the ground up. But Lewis Adams planted the seed. Lewis Adams is the conceptual founder and father of Tuskegee, okay? And with those simple words saying, a school for my people, what would happen is Foster would go back to the state of Alabama and petition the Senate for monies for the Negro Normal School at Tuskegee, which would be housed in the AMU church. It would be a school for teachers initially. And Lewis Adams, to me, is symbolic of us as a people collectively, who we were at that moment in time, right? Having walked and fought our way out of 250 years of enslavement, okay? No one is more deprived than a formerly enslaved person. But when asked what he wanted, he couldn't even think about what he wanted. He's talking about what he needs, what he has to have for his people. And so when I talk about education in the African people, you know, we deal with a lot of stuff, right? Like people try to say we don't value education. Please, we were one step out of enslavement and building schools, okay? And teaching each other how to read. At Washington's school that he went to, Hampton, there is a story of a young lady who began teaching formerly enslaved persons there. And a mother and daughter used to share a dress to go and study and learn. They had one dress coming out of the war, the end of enslavement. They would share the dress. One would wear the dress one day, the other would wear the dress the other day, to get educated, to learn how to read, right? We didn't have a concept of people not being able to learn. That's nonsense, okay? We risked our lives to learn, okay? And when we had nothing else, when we thought about what to build, we were building educational institutions, okay? I can't stress it enough. No one is more deprived than a formerly enslaved person, okay? You are deprived of your personhood, let alone things, right? So Lewis Adams is our conceptual founder, but Booker T. Washington is the father of Tuskegee. He would raise it, he would cultivate it, he would discipline it, he would expand it. And with that, he would take the institution from the Negro Normal School at Tuskegee to Tuskegee Institute. But Washington would make his own mark on the institution. He would, in 1893, do something that is totally characteristic of him. And let me go back. He would do something totally characteristic of him because he felt independence was the most important thing. So Foster would get $2,000. Senator Foster would get $2,000 to allocate to Tuskegee for the Negro Normal School at Tuskegee, but it was only for teacher salaries. They had no building, they had no books, they had nothing, okay? But they were allowed to build the school or have school meetings in an AME church in Tuskegee. Washington would slowly, from contributions, build the school. He had teachers, but not much else. Eventually, Washington, and some of you may not know this, linked up with Ford, okay? Ford, yes, the Model T Ford, the car. And he would begin raising funds with Ford. He would ride around with Ford and raise money. By the time 1893 comes, Washington has figured out that he does not need the state of Alabama to control Tuskegee. He could raise that and more on the road with Ford. And so in 1893, Booker T. Washington tells the state of Alabama, keep your money. Keep your money. Okay? We are independent. And he reinitiates the institute and the institution as Tuskegee Institute and establishes a new charter. And with the new charter, once again, Tuskegee is established as a school for teachers that teaches the academics and then the vocations, okay? And it is with that Washington makes Tuskegee independent from the state of Alabama. He says, keep your $2,000, I'm gonna go over here with Ford, raise this money, establish a new charter, and give the school to the people. All right, that's what it does. He makes the school independent of the state. This is why to this day, Tuskegee has a very unique classification, which is quasi-private. It is private, but state affiliated when it needs to be. Okay, and that is a distinct mark of a Booker T. Washington, because he would begin what others would try to imitate and fail at, which was a dance with the U.S. government. Okay, this, you know how they say, do not do this at home or do not duplicate this. He should have put that disclaimer on, any account of what he was doing with the U.S. government, because others would come behind him and think that they can engage the U.S. government and not be harmed by the government and fail at that. The evidence of stuff like that, where future presidents would engage the U.S. government and fail miserably, would be what you all know as the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, right? Which is under the President Foster. And all of them understood that Booker T. Washington had a very unique way of being able to engage power but not be hurt by those entities or individuals who were powerful, okay? He was not harmed. He utilized Theodore Roosevelt. He utilized in many ways Taft, even though they thought they were utilizing him. But he was certainly not harmed by them, okay? Other leaders who would lead Tuskegee particularly the presidents, would think that they could duplicate their engagement with the government, like they could duplicate his engagement with the government, without understanding that Washington was a unique person and very sophisticated to engage in the way that he was. But Foster would fail. Tuskegee syphilis experiment, some of you know, in brief, the entire experiment was meant to go to the tertiary stage and exact autopsies on individuals who had died from syphilis. It was simply a racist experiment on the part of the United States government to see if the symptoms of syphilis in the tertiary stage were different in the African person. This all comes from this racist pathology that assumes or tries to assert that the African person is a different type of human being or questionably human in comparison to the European person. Ridiculous, the notion. African people are the humans, first and foremost, okay? Yeah, the parent people, right? So there's great irony in the world that people ponder or question our humanity when we are the human blueprint, without a doubt, you know, and that's proven over and over and over again every day. So this thing called Tuskegee that Washington is involved in, he is highly sophisticated in fundraising, as you guys probably already know. He understands how to engage the government to the benefit of the institution. He takes the institution away from the state of Alabama, the government, makes it independent, and then perfects 44 industries. And Washington's critics would look at Tuskegee and the Tuskegee model and make speculation about it. Not all wrong speculation, but a man, Thomas Dixon, I think I mentioned him before, but I'm going to go to it again. Thomas Dixon, who was an adversary of Booker T. Washington and thought that Washington had white America fooled, bamboozled, and he attempted to expose this, would write a expose in the Philadelphia Saturday paper. So Thomas Dixon, he was the author of a book called The Klansman. The Klansman was the book that inspired the film Birth of a Nation at the turn of the century. And this man, Thomas Dixon, was an adversary who had an ongoing vendetta with Booker T. Washington. Dixon would write in the Saturday paper about Tuskegee, attempting to talk about what Tuskegee truly was and not what Washington promoted it to be. So in other words, Dixon is saying, this guy Washington, be careful. He has all you Southern whites and even Northern white philanthropists, he's got you fooled. You don't know what he's about, you don't know what he's up to, but let me tell you what he's up to. So Thomas Dixon wrote this article called Booker T. Washington and the Negro, Some Dangerous Aspects of the Work of Tuskegee. It was in the Saturday Evening Post, Philadelphia, published in August of 1905. And this is what Thomas Dixon wrote. He said, Mr. Washington is not training Negroes to take their place in the industrial system of the South in which the white man directs or controls him. He is not training his students to be servants and come at the beck and call of any man. He is training them all to be masters of men, to be independent, to own and operate their own industries, to plant their own fields, buy and sell their own goods, and in every shape and form destroy the last vestige of dependence on the white man for anything. Every pupil who passes through Mr. Washington's hands cease forever to work under a white man. Not only so, but he goes forth, trained as an evangelist to preach the doctrine of separation and independence. Dixon was, in many ways, very right. Now, could he get white philanthropists who were consistently making contributions to Washington and Tuskegee to turn their backs? No, not at all. That did not happen. In fact, his cries about the true nature of Tuskegee would go unnoticed. Okay, and he would not manage to derail Tuskegee. However, Washington was involved in perfecting the 44 industries, and many would notice this. Another writer or journalist rather, would talk about the model that was Tuskegee. His name was Arthur Evans, and he would talk about Tuskegee in a Chicago paper called the Chicago Record Herald. And on May 4th, 1912, he wrote in an issue, a school. Tuskegee is not a school in the ordinary sense of the word. It's a city in itself, a community that dominates a whole county. It's a great industrial plant with 40 trades and industries that consumes all its own products, that erects its own buildings, first making its own bricks, that grows its own food, makes its own clothes, writes and prints its own textbooks, all by way of education. So in other words, others had noticed that Tuskegee was not exactly this school for vocational industrial education produced to educate only manual laborers. It was in fact a place where they were engaging in sustainable projects, but also they were engaged in nation management practices, nation building practices. Absolutely, okay? This is why Thomas Dixon and even Arthur Evans is talking about the fact that Tuskegee is not a school in the ordinary sense of the word, right? So it's a great industrial plant with 40 trades and industries that consumes all its own products, erects its own buildings, first by making its own brick, right? Famous Alabama red clay made the Tuskegee brick, that grows its own food and makes its own clothes, writes and prints its own textbooks, all by way of education. And so with the perfecting of those 44 industries at Tuskegee, Washington at a certain point is confident, and he is exporting, in part, some of those industries to the continent of Africa via, first and foremost, his international students from the continent, okay? From 1893, the same year where the new charter was made for Tuskegee, Washington began accepting a steady flow of students from the African continent, 1893. And so he is not just exporting the Tuskegee model to the continent, but he is exporting it through his students who are indigenous to the continent. So in other words, returning and engaging in those practices. He also had the view of right of return, basically, for African students in America. So African American, or whatever you want to say, Black American. He also preaches the same thing, that with the methods that you learn at Tuskegee, one must return to their home community, wherever that is, and share and build and teach, essentially. And so it's with this understanding that Booker T. Washington begins to export the Tuskegee model and eventually ends up in the situation that is the Togo. Now, I covered the Togo before. I didn't go real deep, but I will, in brief, say that the Togo in particular was the transformational moment in Washington's life. I did touch on it last time, but for those who are seeing this for the first time, the Togo expedition was an expedition that was proposed by the German colonial forces. Bottom line, their objective was to produce cotton, run a cotton expedition. They would solicit student graduates from Tuskegee to help them because it was already well known that Tuskegeans were forerunners in agriculture. Okay? In 1895, none other than who? The great scientist, yes, absolutely, comes to Tuskegee, right? So 1895, the great scientist George Washington Carver would grace Tuskegee, and he was brilliant and would produce hundreds of inventions, all of which you can see at the George Washington Carver Museum at Tuskegee. And most of his patents would be stolen by the U.S. government, side note. But we knew that George Washington Carver was not just a pioneer in agricultural methods, but an inventor of many things that were, how would you say, organic and natural from the earth, right? Coming out of his chemistry brain and his agricultural practices, he is able to invent a number of things. That being said, these students were instructed and taught by, a George Washington Carver, cross-breeding, different strands of cotton, and things of that nature. Yes, U.S. Southern cotton was coveted by the rest of the world. Even the Pope wanted to wear Southern plantation cotton from the U.S. It was coveted, believe it or not. Tuskegee was engaging in the cross-breeding of strands of cotton, and they would take this experimentation in cotton production to Togo. Not in on the politics of Togo, not in collusion with the German regime. Graduates would go and engage in producing cotton for the German colonial regime. Washington would give that nod for that to happen and possibly even hand select some of the graduates who would go. One of the Callaway brothers would be one of them who would go to Togo and engage in this expedition. However, the Germans, I'm gonna give you guys a summary because there is a Zimmerman, and I mentioned this before, there is a man named Zimmerman who wrote a book called Alabama and Africa that I wouldn't say it's a rival to this book. It's a totally different context. It is someone celebrating the coalescing of European multinational productions. So it is a negation of the life and the stories that are told in that context. But how I tell the Togo story is correct, in my opinion, because it recognizes and respects the human loss. Any strides made in Togo around cotton expedition would never be worth what happened in Togo. There were about 9 graduates who went to Togo to engage in the cotton expedition. They were just cross-breeding cotton. They were also sharing Tuskegee methods in the house building, brick making, things of that nature. And all of the graduates, well, 4, we know for sure, of the graduates would die in Togo. Washington agreed to engage this because of his own issues and contradictions, meaning that Washington, as I told you, wanted to go to Africa. He talks about this in the story of the Negro. He realized he'll never get to do vicariously through his graduates. And so he sends them to Togo to engage in this cotton expedition. It is catastrophic. The human loss outweighs any strides made in the area of cotton production. And all cotton production would be to the credit of Germany anyway. It was a lesson for Washington, but it was definitely not an exhibition of Tuskegee or Washington engaging in colonizing Togo. Now, I know some young people who are not quite familiar with the reach and the depth of this story and the politics around this particular time in history and this scenario specifically. But Tuskegee never was interested in colonizing. You know, it's sort of an insane thing to have to respond to. But Washington makes it clear when writing a venture capitalist who wrote to him first and said, I want to colonize the Negro in the Sudan. Washington swiftly wrote back to him, good luck to you, essentially, but I do not support the colonizing of the Negro anywhere, okay? So there you are for the historical record, right? You know, you have people who latch on to things, they get bits and pieces of research, they don't read books from cover to cover, and want to sort of jump into conversations without the deep and tedious level of research that it takes to understand the situation. And that being said, so we have some young scholars who came out and said, Tuskegee and Washington colonized Togo. First of all, even if that was a desire, they did not have the might or wherewithal to do such things. You're talking about a little old school and a few handful of graduates, 9 graduates going to colonize the whole African country. But the desire wasn't even there, and the ideation didn't exist in them either. So it's a moot point. That being said, Washington, this is a transformational moment for Washington, okay? He comes to understand the posture he must have when he is engaging Africa. You can't work with the German colonial regime. You cannot. Can't. Just simply can't. They are colonizing African people, right? Oppressing and exploiting their labor and exploiting them as human beings in general. So Washington gets that lesson. This moment, and this was really the hardest thing to write about in this book, I always say it, because it's hard to explain to people how someone transforms. And we don't necessarily transform by basking in the sun. It's through hardship very often that we transform, and we respond to the need to transform, okay? And Washington did that. Coming out of this situation in the Togo, you will see him in a new posture. In the first case, he will have the opportunity to show what he has learned over the years. Would be the Liberian crisis, where he seeks to preserve the Liberian state as we know it to be, right? A country, right? And it's with that understanding that he is able to navigate about 5 years of negotiations between the U.S. government, the Liberian officials, and bring the situation to a reasonable agreement that essentially the United States will stay out of Liberia, and the French and the British would also as well, right? But it's only with, the story I'm seeking to tell in this book is about Washington's transformation, hence the making of a Pan-Africanist, right? He is not a Pan-Africanist in the beginning, where he's just wondering about Africa Africa, looking at Africa through the image of his mother. All of that, those are building blocks. But when he gets to the Togo expedition, this is the moment where he is completely transformed. The death of the 4 graduate students in the Togo would put a cloud over Tuskegee and even Washington in his desire to send more and more people to the continent of Africa to implement what? The Tuskegee model, okay? He comes out of that experience matured, informed in nuanced ways, and then he moves on and he is ready and prepared to engage in what would be the Liberian crisis, and then eventually he is able, as a result of those experiences, move decisively in the context of the African exclusion measure, okay? But let me just get a little bit into this thing called, I think I went over some of the African affiliates, African national affiliates that he was in relationship with. But I want to stress a couple of others that he was involved with on the continent. So there's the Togo expedition, and then there is his numerous relationships with various African nationalists. I can, let me see if I can roll call them. I will. There's a few. There's Duse Muhammad Ali, which some of you might know. There's also Chilembwe of Malawi. There's also Dube of South Africa. There's also, who else? A few, I'm skipping. Casey Hayford of the Gold Coast. And he would have a number of relationships with African nationalists, communicating with them, engaging in this dialectical relationship about the conditions on the continent. Okay, so here's the roll call. So on the other side of the Togo expedition, Washington is in a different posture, ready to engage, and these are all the individuals. He encountered John Dew and Isake Simi of South Africa. Later, he communicated with Duse Muhammad Ali. He's very famous in terms of our Pan-African history because Duse Muhammad Ali was also in touch with who? Marcus Garvey. So Duse Muhammad Ali is of Egypt and he lived in Nigeria. He also had direct influence on other African nationalists such as Solomon Platt, DDT Jabavu, Casey Hayford, and A. Kirkland Soga. Many of these men became early organizers and founding members of the South African Native National Congress and the African National Congress. So all of these people Washington is engaging are early members, 2 individuals, particularly in South Africa, early members of the ANC, the African National Congress. So you can see, just sort of like the network of people that he's engaging at this moment in time. The relationships that Washington developed were not one-sided. They were dialectical and essential to the development to his development as a Pan-Africanist. The sophistication in African affairs that Washington acquired was due to the details shared by African nationalists who were adept at discussing the nuances of their plight in Africa, in the same way that Marcus Garvey discussed the social and political circumstances as they existed in Jamaica at that time. John Dew discussed the challenges he faced in South Africa with Washington. The others, who primarily wrote and visited with various African countries, also shared the state of affairs in their locales. As we know, Washington also communicated with Pan-Africanists like Henry Sylvester Williams, originally from Trinidad, John Dew of South Africa, and Casey Hayford of the Gold Coast. So he is communicating with various African nationalists on the continent of Africa. He is propagandizing against the atrocities in the Congo under King Leopold. And he would, from there, go into the Liberian crisis, where he writes, and I open the chapter with this: "No one, not even the citizens of Liberia, are more interested in the progress and the success of the Republic than I am." And with that, Washington would pledge, essentially, to see Liberia through this crisis of encroachment by the French and the British. I'm not going to tell you the whole story. Some of you probably already know it, but the chapter is about 24 pages where I detail how Washington would be the key negotiator and advance the agenda of the African population, not simply the Americo-Liberian population or the indigenous African Liberian population. And I'm going to skip to sort of like the end of what he said about that, which was, well, let me give you a couple of highlights first. So Washington is asked to engage in the Liberian crisis because of the encroachment, right? Taking land on either side by the French and the British. Washington responds and immediately contacts Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt affirms him and says, yes, I will support you in your effort to help Liberia. Washington then organizes for there to be a delegation from Liberia to come to the United States. That's this picture, right? Well, I say this picture because they're in the shadows, if you have noticed. But the original picture is in there, only to be seen elsewhere, only in the Tuskegee archives. That being said, Washington would bring this delegation to the United States. Roosevelt, although on board, is still a white American president. And Washington says, we need some pomp and circumstance for the Liberian Commission. This is unprecedented. We have never had a group of African people who left as enslaved persons come back to the United States in this way as the leaders of an African nation. He is excited about this. He wants to celebrate this. But Theodore Roosevelt says, no. We're not doing any big ceremonies or pomp and circumstance for the Liberian Commission. Liberia is in fact in a bad way. Okay? They're in crisis. We're not doing that. And certainly you understand the positioning of a white American president. Why are we going to celebrate these African people who used to be enslaved and, made it and are on the other side and on the African? Why would we celebrate their return to ask for support, right? But Washington, he closely identifies not only just with the Americo-Liberian or the African person who settles in Liberia, he also identifies with the indigenous Liberian person. I mean, it's just really, I can't stress it enough how much he is connected and invested in the life, the perception, and the outcomes of African people on the continent who had never been displaced by slavery, right? When he is involved in a colorism conversation in the story of the Negro, he begins to talk about how he believes that the African person who is with undisturbed generations, right, without rape, right, the African person who has never been raped, right, who makes his way to an educational institution, he affirms that he, from his experience, in fact, sees that person as the most intelligent, as opposed to those who are intermingled with Europeans, okay, by blood, right? So rape in that context, of course. So in other words, the conversation of whether the mulatto or the fully African person is more or less intelligent than the other. Washington says definitively in the story of the Negro that he has always found superior intelligence among our people who are wholly African. He talks about that. There's almost nothing he leaves untouched in the story of the Negro, okay? And so when it comes to this instance with Liberia, his ideation does not allow him to engage in the pathology that would create a circumstance where the indigenous Liberian person is marginalized and discriminated against and negated, okay? So he is opposed to that. But during the course of the case, he has moments where he is actually expressing to them what he thinks about the conditions in Liberia as a result of the Americo-Liberian. The assumption is that Washington is aligned, and I've had this because I've had people who try to critique this book without reading it, of course, and said that, oh, Washington's support of Liberia is just some of that, you know, basically that's that old Negro stuff. You're aligned with those black people who went back and discriminated against indigenous African people, who were colorists, who were identifying with America in the wrong way, right? But in Africa now. Washington, all of that can easily be debunked by Washington's movements and motions in the Liberian crisis. So I'm going to read Washington's recommendations. I don't want to give it all away. I do want people to read the book because there's not a presentation I could do that could do this fully justice. You have to just read it, essentially, because there's so much covered in here and so much of the situations and scenarios are intertwined. But in the case of Liberia, there's a couple of things that happen. Washington is involved in brokering a multinational loan. It falls through. Once again, he's fighting to keep Liberia on the U.S. agenda so that he could solicit whatever support. As you guys remember, when I came in, I stated that in the Liberian crisis, the U.S. sat off the coast of Liberia, occasionally coming inland to put down clashes between the indigenous Liberian population and the Americo-Liberian population. But beyond that, they were not involved. There is a U.S. delegation that goes to Liberia to see. And in that delegation are 3 white men and Emmett J. Scott, who I should never forget. Emmett J. Scott is Booker T. Washington's personal executive secretary. And in the Liberian crisis, in the absence of Washington's ability to travel to Liberia, Emmett J. Scott goes to Liberia on his behalf instead. And they would have a squabble, these 3 white men and Emmett J. Scott, that would make the New York Times in that day. The squabble was over the fact that these white males who were involved in doing this fact-finding mission in Liberia were still, in fact, good old-fashioned American racists and would refuse to ride across the Atlantic in a vessel with a black person, namely Emmett J. Scott. Washington's secretary. So the case would make an appearance in the New York Times under the title "Travel Separately to Africa," about the fact that Emmett J. Scott went in a vessel, the other gentleman went in a vessel, the second one went in a vessel, the third would go in a vessel to Africa because the white males refused to ride on one vessel across the Atlantic to Liberia. It's this sentiment Washington is pushing against. He is in engagement with these white American politicians, forcing them to do what needs to be done for Liberia. One of his exchanges with Theodore Roosevelt in the process of all of this, and Washington is considering becoming a Liberian official himself. One talks him out of it and says, you can help Liberia much more as an American, which you are, but not as a Liberian, which you are not. They are worrying about how he is thinking about himself because he is deeply invested in the welfare of Liberia. But Washington, a smart guy, he manages, in spite of all the resistance and all of the, how would you say, posturing on the part of the American politician, he makes it clear to Theodore Roosevelt at that point, mid the case, that whatever you do or fail to do for Liberia will be remembered by the masses of African people. I'm saying African people, he says by the masses of Negroes in America. The 4 million Negroes in America will remember what you did or what you failed to do for Liberia come voting time. So here you have, once again, on the other side of this transformation, Washington very strategically leveraging the black vote. Does he believe in voting? No, obviously so. Leveraging the black vote against Theodore Roosevelt and Taft in order to force them to support the survival of Liberia. Okay? Very interesting. So when people talk about who Washington was and where his loyalty lied or was, it is very clear. He is maneuvering and he is maneuvering, politicking, negotiating, you name it, behind the scenes on behalf of African people on both sides, okay? So it's with that there becomes a deal. The Senate proposes a deal to secure Liberia. It falls through. I won't give you all the details, but essentially it fell through. And I give that to you in the book. But then there is a second, under the table, quiet deal that is brokered at the behest of Booker T. Washington, that is able to unrightfully, undeservingly pay the British, pay the French to get the hell out of Liberia, essentially, is what happens. But it is Washington who shows that he has the endurance to engage in long-term negotiations. This is a long, protracted negotiations over the span of 5 years to negotiate the survival of Liberia, okay? And he does that successfully. The recommendations that he gave, I think I shared them last time, but the recommendations were important. It's Washington's philosophy. If you don't remember anything about Washington, what you should remember is his philosophy. What was it? It was independence through industry. Okay? It was independence through industry. And the idea was that you produce everything that you consume. If you don't produce it, you probably should not consume it. And so in his final recommendations to Liberia in particular, he highlights the problem with consuming European and Western goods. I'm sure I said this last time, but I will say it again. His words were, every time you open a can in Liberia, or you import a can into Liberia, you seal the fate of Liberians in poverty. Okay? Period. He goes on to talk about the tax, the can itself, the import, export, you know, all of that. Meanwhile, you can produce your own food, your own, you know, your own goods from the raw materials. And that's really what he is a proponent of. But he gives, and I will give you the key 3 recommendations as it's written here. Booker T. Washington gave his own recommendations, which he communicated directly to Ernest Lyon, President Daniel Howard of Liberia, and President Daniel Howard of Liberia. His advice and recommendations addressed 3 important areas of Liberian life: education, economics, and the social relations that had been disrupted since the settlement of Americo-Liberians in the country. First, Washington warned President Howard regarding the rift between Liberians and Americo-Liberians. Washington knew that the conflict between the 2 groups held the potential to destabilize the nation. He suggested that the whole future of Liberia hinges upon its ability to get hold of the native population, for the tribal Liberian has a very real grievance against the minority of Americo-Liberians, descendants of deported American slaves who ran the government and controlled the economy. So in other words, he's saying the indigenous person, and so if you thought Washington was on the side of the Americo-Liberian population, you will understand in this context, he was not. He is not. He is criticizing them, saying that if they do not get themselves together as it relates to the indigenous Liberian population, it will be the detriment of the country. It will destroy the country from inside. And to be quite frank with you, there's really only one good way to destroy a country, and that's from the inside. You understand? External forces really can't do much to you. They do superficial damage. But if you want to thoroughly destroy something, you destroy it from the inside. You understand? This is how people destroy their homes, from the inside. How people destroy countries from the inside. That being said, that is his critique and his criticism to the leadership in Liberia, right? Second, Washington advised President Howard to develop and implement industrial education programs aimed at stimulating the establishment of industry in the country. Washington had a very shrewd outlook on economic advancement, and regardless of his relations with Western officials, he advised Liberia against the consumption of Western goods, writing to the Liberian Register. He said every time a Liberian eats a tin can of goods imported from any country, it means poverty for Liberians. It means that Liberians are paying somebody else to manufacture the tin cans and paying the freight upon the cans, and all of the course means money taken out of Liberia. Although Washington had been cited as pro-capitalist, his inclination was to protect Liberia from the pitfalls of consumption as opposed to production. Conceptually, this belief was consistent with Washington's philosophy of sustainable economic independence, which was essential in developing Liberia as a nation. And then lastly, his third recommendation to Liberia was philosophically, he wanted that he desired that there should be a school, a Tuskegee-like school, erected in Liberia to produce these masters of various industries, right? These masters of men. And eventually, not in Washington's time, but in conjunction with the Olivia Phelps Stokes Fund or Foundation, if that was a real person, he would actually eventually get a school. So there is a Booker T. Washington School in Liberia today. Recently, well, not recently, but last year, almost this time, I met the president of Liberia, and he read my book, and it was a great opportunity to really engage around this convergence of our history, right? We are connected, Liberia and the African population in the United States. So it was an interesting moment to hear on the other side of that period, right? Meaning, what was the perception of the history as it's being taught today about this moment in time, 1907-08 to 1912, when Liberia underwent this particular crisis and Booker T. Washington stepped in, okay? So I'm gonna leave it there, but I did have one little thing that I wanted to share to connect it to the reality of today, or just some contemporary problems, because one of the things about history and why we study it is that it is a story of power, right? Who has it, who wrestled it away, what he or she or we did with it when we wrestled it away, and on and on. So history in many ways is a story about the movement of power over time as it flows from hand to hand, group to group. And Booker T. Washington very much understood this, right? He was seeking really to make his own mark from the highest of his own values on the African world. So, you know, I don't want to use someone else's words that just came to my mind, but essentially he was trying to bring the Tuskegee model, head, heart, hand, to African people in a way that was going to help us navigate this very critical period in our history, not just in the United States, but in the world. This moment in history was called the nadir, right? The nadir. Some people call it nadir, nadir. 1895 and to 1915. And it was one of the most violent periods in American history, where the number of lynchings every week were astronomical, easily 5 to 7. By the way, I know you've read the book, but if you notice early in the book, I tell you a little bit about this period and how this work comes about. Booker T. Washington would be the collector of something called the lynching files. From 1895 to 1915, he would be the person who cut out newspaper articles from all the subscriptions that would come, that he had subscribed to, that would come into the Institute. He meticulously would cut out each and every article that was documented in the papers across the nation about lynching. He would take this information and he would extract data from it. Who was lynched, where they were lynched, what the accusation was, because some may or may not remember that lynching is not about, lynching is not you know, we think about lynching being hung by the neck, abused from the ceiling. That's not necessarily what the lynching is. The lynching is the context. You are accused of something. You're thrown in jail. And then the lynch mob comes to the jail, overwhelms the jailer. He cannot protect the prisoner. And takes you from the jail, and the mob engages in mob justice. That is the lynching. Very often you are tarred and feathered, burnt at the stake, shot to pieces, then hung by your neck, lynched to terrorize the living. The dead, that's not to terrorize the dead. The dead is already gone. The remains are meant to terrorize the living. Washington would document all of these lynchings, or collect the documentation of all of these lynchings. I myself had an opportunity to look at this collection with my own hands as a history student at Tuskegee. There's over 2,000 newspaper clippings of lynchings that took place in the United States during this very period where Washington is doing all of this behind the scenes, okay? He compiles it, and today that collection is called the Tuskegee University Lynching Files. It is part of the Tuskegee University newspaper clippings collection. Today it is sold all over the world, this collection of lynchings. Years ago, there was a white gentleman who did an exhibit called Without Sanctuary, where he featured a number of lynchings, and he took a traveling exhibition around the country. Few people know that there is almost no lynching that you could find today that does not come from the Booker T. Washington or the Tuskegee University lynching files. It is the largest and most massive collection, period. What Washington would use the collection for is to map the movements of Southern whites who were engaging in lynching, okay? Where they were, who they were lynching, how, and then later on, this same information would be used to produce reports on race relations, and also utilized by the Southern Poverty Law Center to produce data on lynchings during that period. I say all of that to say that Washington was a peculiar individual, but a very wise and extraordinary individual, born in slavery, but daring before the end of his life to negotiate the fate of an African nation and to challenge the very government he lived under and was sometimes accused of being aligned with. He would challenge them on the welfare and the life chances and outcomes of African people globally. I'm going to end with just how I ended the book, where I talk about Booker T. Washington and giving him a new narrative. Booker T. Washington, the discourse on Booker T. Washington should now include not only his rhetoric around accommodation, but his actions and efforts as a Pan-Africanist. Washington can no longer be discussed as simply an accommodationist in intellectual discourse or the larger American narrative due to his role in African affairs and the cases presented in this book. This work is also concerned with the creation of a new narrative for African people, both on the continent and in the diaspora, which highlights the interdependent, transformative, and dialectical relationships we had and continue to have that facilitate the African struggle for liberation. I have a number of things that I can say, but really what I wanted to end with was this idea and concept that Washington had about Tuskegee, about what Tuskegee was producing in the world, which were captains of industry, masters, of course men, not in a negative way, but this idea that we were essentially meant to make a contribution to the plight of African people. And in Washington words, in the story of the Negro, he talks about, quote, being involved with Africa in some significant way. And ultimately, that is what he did. This was his, I guess it was from his mouth to the ancestor in God's ears, because he would, in a very significant way, shift the dynamics for African people, not just in the United States, but actually impact the outcomes for African people outside of the United States even more. Okay? Meaning the African exclusion measure, those who were locked out could now come in and come into our communities. Liberian crisis, essentially Liberia would live to fight another day, and survive. And so what would have been only one African nation, independent African nation, Liberia, today we still have two independent African nations that were that remain uncolonized on the continent, right? So I'll leave it there though.
Those two countries are Liberia and who else?
Ethiopia.
Those have not been colonized.
Never colonized. The Italians took a portion of Ethiopia, which is, how do you know that? You know that because that's the Ethiopian-Eritrean conflict. The territory that is present-day Eritrea was the territory that the Italians were able to seize and take. And so then when the Eritreans kick out the Italians, of course, there is a struggle because Ethiopia feels as though Eritrea is a part of Ethiopia. It originally was, but that was the territory that was taken by the Italians. However, the vast majority of Ethiopia was uncolonized, and the only other African country that was uncolonized, that was not colonized, was Liberia.
What about Sierra Leone?
Sierra Leone, the British. It was, but you're right in the sense that I was just watching a documentary on Sierra Leone and the fact that Sierra Leone has formerly enslaved African people who move up to are promised by the British freedom, right? But then they are not able to get them to freedom. They go up to what is Canada. Some go up to the area known as Nova Scotia, and then, of course, they are resettled in Sierra Leone. But territorially, I don't think that Sierra Leone was left uncolonized. I'm pretty sure the British, who would bring those individuals who were escaping what was the American Revolution, the backlash for the American Revolution, if you recall the history of that. So the American Revolution, the British, the so-called Anglo-American peasant class in rebellion from their British aristocracy, right? The African person, particularly in this part of the country, the North, many African people who are in the North end up being recruited by the British to fight. And they do. However, when the British lose the war, and I actually used to be an interpreter for a historic site in what is present-day Mount Vernon. It used to be Old Eastchester, and it was a site. It was a Revolutionary War era site, and I actually rediscovered an African man who fought in the American Revolution returned to his community, which was unusual because most used the opportunity to flee when the war came, right? Enslaved persons would flee. They took that opportunity when the British come, inland and are engaging in fight, battle at Pell's Point and places like that in New York, and what is present-day Westchester. That being said, this individual that I rediscovered, his name was Nathaniel Franklin, he fought in the American Revolution. He returns to the community, Old Eastchester, present-day Mount Vernon, and instead of being awarded his freedom, fighting on the American side, he was rewarded with 40-something more years of enslavement, okay? He would not be freed until his enslaver's wife, Gloriana Franklin, gave him his freedom, and his wife. So he fought in the American Revolution for these people's freedom from the British. He only returns to Eastchester, the community, because he has a wife and he has a child. But most people would have taken an opportunity to run far away, never return to enslavement, right? The American peasant class, who are now the colonists, which would be the new Americans, right? They were British subjects at that time. They would not free the people, the black people who fought with them against the British. Okay, they never promised freedom. That's why I get mad sometimes at my brothers and sisters from Haiti, because they like to cite that Africans out of Haiti supported the Anglo-Americans in their struggle against the British. And I have a problem with that because the Americans never promised freedom in the American Revolution. Okay, they never promised it. It was the British, only the British were promising freedom. That's how Nova Scotia, that's how Sierra Leone, all of these other things come into fruition. That being said, in the case of Nathaniel Franklin, he comes back, he is enslaved, to be exact, 47 more years. And at the end of his life, 72 years old, his enslaver, Gloriana Franklin, would award him a homestead, $750, and some tools to work the land. And it is celebrated at St. Paul's National Historic Site as such a great thing, and then I came there.
At 72, what could he do?
Right, and rediscovered the fact that Nathaniel Franklin was indeed a Revolutionary War soldier who fought on the American side, survived, and then came back only for them to re-enslave him for 47 more years. Okay?
All right.
Yeah.
One quick question from the Zoom, if you want to say something, and you got to answer in a couple of minutes.
Okay, yes.
Anybody
yes.
from the Zoom want to make a question?
Yes, or you, or...
No, let's do
Oh,
the
okay,
Zoom.
okay.
No. Okay, going once, going twice. That's a wrap on the Zoom. Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry, about the head, heart, and hand. I've heard a few people that use that term. You know where it originated? Because I know Marion Clyde Bethune had used it, and I know they met.
Yes.
But where did it originate?
They were...
something from church or...
Yeah, they were two of a kind. I mean, so a lot of people, now I don't want to get into the battle of the HBCUs, but a lot of people don't understand that there's a lot of different kind of HBCUs, right? So there's the HBCUs that were founded by white people for black people, right? The Lincolns, the Howards. I'm sorry, guys, it's true. The Lincolns, the Howards, the Fisk. I think I talked about that because Fisk is a black school founded by white people. So there are many. However, yes, Bethune-Cookman and Washington belong in the same conversation because Bethune-Cookman College and Tuskegee are in a group of historically black colleges founded by black people for black people, right? Growing out of the community. But what hand, heart, and head means, so at Tuskegee, that was the sacred mission. With our hand, our heart, and our heads, that we would produce. So in other words, so let me just kind of give a little context. Tuskegee would be an institution that employed, and you probably heard about this, employed their students. That every student at Tuskegee up until the 70s, or most students up until the 1970s, were on the work program, where you went to school part-time the first year, worked for the school full-time, okay, first year. All subsequent years, you went to school full-time and worked for the institution part-time, okay? This gave Tuskegee a constant labor force, and very often, most of the students did not pay tuition. This is how they worked out their balance. And so the understanding was that that seat that you have at Tuskegee could be held by, you know, another person who could internalize and embody the mission. So head, our intellect, because we are a school of teachers. That's what Tuskegee is. Both charters established that Tuskegee is a school for teachers. Heart, of course, because love, we're in touch. But hand, because the hand is overwhelmingly the worker hand, the hand of the agriculturalist, the hand of the mason, the hand of the builder. And I don't mean the Freemason, I mean the mason, because we made the bricks that made the buildings, right? At Tuskegee, so we were teaching brick masonry. If you see in the book, I give you a picture of that. But you see that they're studying the theoretical side of brick masonry, and then they're studying the actual practice, right? So you see that in the imagery because they are also theoreticians, right? So they understand the theory and the practice because ultimately they are teachers, right? They're going to teach us, so they need to understand the theory behind brick making. But the idea was that we are ultimately to participate in practice. If you turn to the back of the book, there is notes that I included. And the notes are from the first International Conference on the Negro held at Tuskegee in 1912. The same one that I said is Washington's Pan-African Conference. And he brings people from all over the world. These notes are from the conference resolution. And I did that on purpose because I wanted everyone to see what he was saying to all of the people at that time. The sacred mission of Tuskegee was to return to your community and put all that you learned from the 44 industries and as a teacher to go build institutions and contribute to your building of your own community, okay? So that was the point of that. But head, heart, and hand is really our motto, and it's really about independence through industry, right? That we were the producers. We would make all of it, right? That's why I gave you the little saying, and we don't even know, it's like urban tale, right? Urban legend, the saying. You know, leave your underwear at home, we make our own at Tuskegee. Because that was the idea that we could produce, we could make, even probably from scratch, if you ask Arthur Evans, that we made everything. Everything that was a human necessity to man, woman, and child. So, you know, in chapter 3, I talk about the programmatic aversion Tuskegee had against producing incomplete products, right? We had to produce products from start to finish. And with the perfecting of those products, that all was shared with the African world at the International Conference of the Negro, where all 44 industries are opened up for members of the African world to come in and take back best practices. So the practices is is the last and final part of the philosophy. And Washington talks about that, how you are, you know, sort of, you are destined and you are overwhelmingly expected to return and make a contribution to your community based on the practices and the methods that you learned at Tuskegee.
All right, so ladies and gentlemen,
Okay, thank you.
we have books here, but she's gonna let you know where you can purchase her book so you can continue on the great work of Booker T. So she's gonna let you know where her books are available. We have them here for members of the Mackey's History Club. So you can let the...
Yes, so you can purchase the book at Booker T. Washington and Africa.com. All one word, Booker, B-O-O-K-E-R-T, Washington, W-A-S-H-I-N-G-T-O-N. And A&D Africa, A-F-R-I-C-A.com. So you can go on Booker T. Washington and Africa.com, get the book. We're sold out on Amazon, but either way, Amazon, I noticed that a secondhand bookseller is selling the book for $95. Don't do that. Go to the book's website. It's been there for the last 10 years. It's reliable enough. Buy the book for 20 bucks. It'll be back on Amazon. It was $32 on Amazon. Some secondhand seller is selling the book for $95.
Yeah.
Like I said, don't do that. Independence through industry. So come get the book from the book's website, and I hope you enjoy it, because I can't even, I'm the author, but I can't even do the book justice just in an hour or two setting. There is so much that intersects and coalesces with our global African history in this book. So you'll see that Washington's scope was so much bigger than any of us understood or knew.
Well, we'll be doing, family, we will be doing part 3. We let it roll a little long because of the trouble happening with the train. We let her go a little, but we have the books here. You can cash at me. If you want to get the book, you can cash at me with my Cash App on the chat, and I will send the book to you via postal tomorrow if you want the book now. You can cash at me. My Cash App is in the chat, and you can cash app and I'll send you the book tomorrow. That's if you want. My Cash App is in the chat. We have a couple here for our members, and give her a great big hand.
Thank you. Yes, they're all over there. I'll sign them for you.
Okay, Zoom audience.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. You can have a little chatter if you want to say something until we clean up. But let's write a great big hand. I'm going to cut the camera off.